So moving to the next then, there are clearly liability that's imposed by statute when there's an improper disclosure of personal information. I'd like you to just review how the cloud, what kind of risk exposure the cloud represents in terms of those kinds of personal information.
Yeah, Rick, it could, with regards to disclosure of information, a security breach, could impact customers greatly and impact many customers at the same time. That's the, I think the plus and the minus maybe of the cloud. If we're talking about a public cloud, that contains many customers, within a given environment, I think that risk is real. To minimize the risk, the hosting company should be taking, taking steps to minimize that catastrophic loss. From a consumer standpoint, it really comes down to, a cost-benefit, risk analysis. What do you as a customer feel comfortable in providing to that cloud provider? And do you feel confident that provider is in a position to, secure your data to ensure it'll be there and be up and ready when you need it?
Good enough. And Yasha, what are your take on this basic question of security?
I generally do agree with the statements Erik made concerning the security of the data that's presented there. There's also a second issue, which is insofar as any of the RMIS represents processes or methods that are unique to your particular company. In other words, this is the way we do it, and this is secret in some sense. No one else knows how we do it. Once your processes move to someone else's machine, then nominally, if there is a breach, if there is a disclosure, what you are doing could become accessible. That would usually not be done to just an internet attacker, but it would be done possibly, and I'm not trying to scare anyone, but industrial espionage, things like that, because now you are not controlling, you don't have physical control over your material. It's whatever's out there at the service provider. And that's not to be panicked, that's simply here to use caution and prudence, and as you've always mentioned, Rick, check what's in the contract.
Right. Well, on that basis, Yasha, are you aware of actual litigation or actual successful lawsuits against the cloud providers and the results of that?
The issue there is complicated, and I hate to use that word or that phrase, but the major problem is the majority of litigation that would go forward is essentially civil, and the majority of those records are sealed, not available for public disclosure. Because if one has a settlement either with an insurance company under indemnification, what have you, or a direct settlement from the cloud provider, the information is not publicly available until one hears rumors of such things. But if you ask for a definite set of precedents, unless there's a criminal prosecution, which is rare, and that's usually against the actual attackers, the hackers, as it were, except for criminal prosecution, most of the records are not publicly available, so there's no way to actually refer back to that. That's also, I think, fairly standard in most civil suits. Would you agree with that, Rick?
Yes, I think it's evolving, and I think the absence is maybe a bit deceiving because, as you say, there's a lot happening that is raising these issues, and it's important as potential consumers that they be recognized and not stick your head in the ground. Erik, getting back to the one element of risk management, what would you recommend if a company were putting data into a public or even a private cloud? What are the best practices from the consumer side with respect to the controlling that data?
Yeah, Rick, so, the key items, we've discussed kind of common themes here, but, having the proper controls in place with regards to, security, privacy. This would include also, ensuring ongoing maintenance, testing of the infrastructure, and providing adequate backup and redundancy of the data. These are all key critical areas that we need to, you as a customer need to make sure that, you're clear on and understand how that information is being handled.
And Yasha, just to reiterate this concern about, there isn't an absolute protection of the data. We know that, and it's possible that some very skilled hacker could wreak damage. But what would your point of view be toward the indemnification of the user of that service in the event of such a loss?
Well, I think there are two basic issues. The actual risk is a cost-benefit analysis, and someone has to look at how much is this information worth. Then the other one is, what are the costs if the information is compromised? There's also the question of any criminal penalties, but in most cases, as was very much early pointed on about safe harbors, if you do what you should be doing, which is encryption and relatively straightforward security matters, it's not your problem in that sense. But on the other hand, if your customers for whom you have risk management data decide that you've been compromised and it's your responsibility, you probably need to contact your attorneys in advance to see what contractual relationships you want with your customers and what insurance or other indemnification is available out there. But in most cases, if you take straightforward security measures, as you pointed out, Rick, you're less likely to be the target. The target will always be who's the easiest one to grab.
Very good. Well, we want to try to provide enough time to discuss the questions as well. But like I said in the beginning, I've been around this business for long enough to know that the boat has probably already left the harbor. I don't mean to say that everybody is going to do everything on the cloud, but there are such strong technical and cost directions and incentives that I think it's going to become a reality for more and more applications, and most likely including claims and risk management. That's my commentary, and I may not turn out to be the case, but I think the practical side of it has been highlighted in the comments both Yasha and Erik, that as a potential buyer of these services, a risk manager, a claims manager, it's incumbent that you not only look at the cost side of it, but you look at the risk side of it and ensure, and here I would strongly recommend that you deal with your own legal departments because they're struggling with these issues all the time, and you'd want to be sure that your workman's compensation data, your personnel data are protected in at least the level that the company has set as a standard. And I'm sure there will be variations in that, but with only the RIMS convention only a week and a half away, there's an awful lot of people that will be talking about the cloud. What concerns me a bit is that an awful lot of that talk is only on the positive side, and it's equally valuable to recognize the downside and bring that into your approach. Well, we've used about 40 minutes of our time, and I would like very much, and I'm sure our speakers would like, to get a better handle on what your concerns are. We've got ample time to address your questions, and we will stay here on the line as necessary to answer them. So the mechanics of this, I'd like our organizer, Marianne, to identify what questions have been submitted and then address them to the appropriate speakers.
Well, thank you, Rick. Hello, Yasha. Hello, Erik. Hello to the people in the audience. We have one really good question here to start with. It says, when discussing security of the data on the cloud, can you provide a comparison of rules relating to private personal data, for example, name, address, date of birth, etc., and confidential corporate information, example, public companies' major risks, strategic plans, etc.? It seems that questioner says, there seems to be a lot of legislation on personal info, but how is corporate information treated? The same, differently?
Well, I will tee it up and then turn it over to the people that truly know. But I think there is a difference. I think the statutory side of this is very focused on personal information, medical information, Social Security, credit cards. That's been very much addressed, and I believe 46 of the 50 states have statutes and penalties for that disclosure. I would guess the more sensitive corporate information is more a matter then of more general law, and you'd have to be able to, it wouldn't be an automatic amount of penalty as clearly as the other. It may not be logical, but I think that, again, becomes an area where if you're using a provider, you need to negotiate what that value is, because probably your best remedy is going to be a civil remedy if your provider was negligent and that provided the opportunity for the disclosure. Erik, Yasha, you want to jump in on that?
Well, if Erik isn't picking up, I agree with you, Rick. There are two things, of course, as I mentioned, and I think the questioner is thinking about the data, not the data of individuals that you mentioned, credit cards, medical history, and so forth, but the corporate data. And then the other is the corporate processes, methods, for lack of a better term, programs that you would develop to do your particular codes, applications that do your particular way of analyzing the data. Once that's out in the cloud, if there's a compromise, there are far fewer legal consequences, as I understand it. So it depends what you have in your contract, how you're indemnified, the risk-benefit to you. In other words, if one of your competitors now knows your processes and what you're doing internally, what happened? Probably it's not a risk management area, but for example, FICO, Fair Isaac, their internal methods and criteria, to the best of my knowledge, have never been publicly revealed. There's various guesses and so forth. Yet everyone depends on that FICO score. So what happens if somebody was to break in and say, this is exactly what they do? Well, then those people who model and attempt to improve their credit position would suddenly say, okay, do this, 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 and this, and your FICO score goes up by 15 points, which can be a significant savings in interest and so on and so forth. So I'm just pointing out that once the process gets out there, you also have another potential loss. Not that that is something to be concerned about directly, but it's something a corporation, a company has to worry about.
Erik, you want to take a look at that question?
Yeah, I'll just make one quick comment. On the two different groups of information that were highlighted. I would say the personal information versus confidential. There's obviously a lot more, I would say, standardization around the personal information, and we're talking about Social Security numbers and names and that sort of thing. When we get into the confidential information, I think there's there's a lot of subjective review of what is confidential information from a customer, from a company standpoint, and from a company standpoint that may mean one thing, from a regulator standpoint that it may mean another. And so I think there still needs to be some clarity on kind of defining additional areas or buckets of information and how those may need to be addressed from a regulatory or legal standpoint.
Good. Are you all ready for another question?
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of discussion about cost savings, and certainly nobody can come up with, a fact, certain dollar or percentage. But do you all have the experience or the background to be able to estimate what kind of savings, a corporation might reasonably expect? Is this like 10% or more along the lines of 50% if they get rid of their own back room, if you will?